The words hit me like shrapnel from an IED blast. My brother Marcus served our country with such honor and distinction. I watched in stunned silence as my younger brother Derek stood at our father's funeral podium, tears streaming down his face as he delivered what should have been my eulogy, what should have been my moment to honor the man who had shaped me into the soldier I became. What should have been my recognition for the 8 years I spent in Afghanistan and Iraq while Derek was partying through college on Dad's dime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I can still feel the weight of my dress blues hanging in my closet at home, the ribbons and medals I'd earned through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights in the desert. The Purple Heart I received after that roadside bomb in Kandahar left me with shrapnel scars and a limp I still carry today. The Bronze Star for the night I carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety while under enemy fire. The Combat Action Badge that marked me as someone who had looked death in the eye and lived to tell about it. All of it, somehow, had become Derek's story in the span of one devastating sentence. My father, Colonel James Mitchell, had been my hero long before I understood what military service truly meant. He'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, came home to a country that spat on him, and still managed to raise 2 children with unwavering discipline and love. When I was 8 years old, I found his old service photos in the attic, black and white images of a young man who looked impossibly brave in his army fatigues. That was the moment I knew I wanted to follow in his footsteps, to make him proud, to carry on the Mitchell family tradition of service that stretched back to World War II. Derek, 3 years younger than me, had always been the golden child. The charming one. The one who could talk his way out of trouble with a smile and a joke. While I was doing push-ups at dawn and studying military history, Derek was perfecting his ability to make everyone in the room love him without ever actually accomplishing anything of substance. Dad called it charisma. I called it manipulation. But even I never imagined Derek would steal my entire military career and present it as his own at our father's funeral. The funeral home was packed with Dad's old army buddies, men and women who had served with him in various capacities over his 30-year career. I recognized many faces from the retirement parties and military gatherings I'd attended since returning from my final deployment 2 years ago. These were people who knew Dad's stories, who understood the weight of service, who had earned the right to grieve a fellow soldier. They sat in respectful silence as Derek continued his performance, nodding along as he described battles he'd never fought and sacrifices he'd never made. Marcus always said that serving in the Rangers taught him what real brotherhood looked like. Derek continued, his voice breaking at just the right moment. Dad was so proud when Marcus made staff sergeant at just 20. So proud of the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, all the commendations that proved the Mitchell family legacy was alive and well. I felt my hands clench into fists in my lap, the familiar sensation I'd learned to control during my anger management sessions at the VA. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in the 3rd row of my own father's funeral, listening to my brother claim credit for the very achievements that had made Dad beam with pride for the past 8 years. The same achievements Derek had openly mocked when I first enlisted, calling me a fool for throwing my life away when I could have gone to college like he did. My Aunt Sarah, Dad's sister, reached over and squeezed my hand. She knew the truth, of course. She'd been at every homecoming, every promotion ceremony, every hospital visit when I was recovering from my injury. Her eyes were filled with the same confusion and anger I felt, but her grip on my hand was firm, keeping me anchored to my seat when every instinct screamed at me to stand up and set the record straight. The funeral program in my lap felt like evidence of my brother's elaborate deception. There in black and white was my military photo in my dress blues, but the caption read, "In honor of Derek Mitchell's service to our country." My Bronze Star citation was reprinted word for word, but with Derek's name substituted for mine. Even the story about the roadside bomb, the one that left me with a permanent limp and nightmares that still wake me up some nights, had become Derek's tale of heroic survival. How had it come to this? How had my own brother managed to orchestrate such a complete theft of my identity? The answer, I realized, lay in the past 6 months since Dad's health began declining. Derek had taken charge of all the funeral arrangements, claiming he wanted to spare me the burden while I was dealing with my own recovery from PTSD. I'd been grateful at the time, touched even, that my brother was finally stepping up to handle family responsibilities. I should have known better. During Dad's final months in hospice care, I'd been his primary caregiver. I was the one who sat by his bedside reading him letters from his old army friends. I was the one who helped him record video messages for his grandchildren he'd never get to meet. I was the one who held his hand when the morphine made him relive Vietnam nightmares, calling out for soldiers who had died 50 years ago. Derek visited twice a week at most, usually for less than an hour, always with an excuse about work or social obligations that couldn't wait. But somehow, Derek had convinced the funeral director, the pastor, and apparently half the congregation that he was the family's military hero. I watched him gesture dramatically as he described the sandstorms of Afghanistan, the IED attacks, the long nights on patrol in hostile territory. Every detail was accurate, because every detail was mine. He'd lifted entire paragraphs from letters I'd written home, stories I'd shared during family dinners, experiences I'd lived through while he was pledging fraternities and failing economics classes. The most painful part wasn't just the theft of my service record, it was watching the faces of Dad's military friends as they nodded along, believing every word. These were men and women who had known me since I was a child, who had watched me grow up around army bases and veteran gatherings. But Derek was a masterful storyteller, and he'd clearly done his homework. He knew enough military jargon, enough specific details about my deployments, enough intimate knowledge of my experiences to make it all sound authentic. I thought about the real Marcus Mitchell, the identity Derek was claiming. The 22-year-old who had shipped out to Afghanistan full of idealism and patriotic fervor. The soldier who learned that war wasn't like the movies, that real combat was chaos and terror and split-second decisions that haunted you forever. The woman who came home with invisible wounds that were just as real as the shrapnel scars on my left leg. That Marcus Mitchell had earned every ribbon, every medal, every commendation through blood and sacrifice, and now she was sitting silently while her brother performed her life story for an audience that should have known better. The church was warm, too warm, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, despite the December chill outside. My dress uniform felt tight across my shoulders, the weight of my actual medals pressing against my chest like accusation. I'd worn my blues to honor Dad, to represent the military family he'd been so proud of. I never imagined I'd be wearing them while listening to my brother steal my service record. Derek's voice rose as he reached the climax of his performance, describing the night I'd earned my bronze. Marcus was leading a patrol when our convoy hit an IED, he said, tears now flowing freely. Instead of taking cover, Marcus ran into the kill zone to pull out 3 wounded soldiers. Dad used to say that was the moment he knew his child had become a true soldier, a true leader. The memory was seared into my brain with perfect clarity, the deafening explosion that flipped our Humvee, the screaming of Sergeant Rodriguez as he tried to crawl away from the burning vehicle, the smell of diesel fuel and blood and burning rubber, the weight of Private Chen's unconscious body as I dragged him to cover while bullets snapped over our heads, the feeling of my own blood running down my leg from where shrapnel had torn through my uniform, the absolute certainty that I was going to die in that sand-covered ditch in Kandahar province, but I hadn't died.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'd lived, and I'd saved 3 lives that night, and now my brother was claiming that moment of terror and courage as his own, complete with the emotional delivery that had always been his specialty. The congregation was hanging on every word, some dabbing at their eyes as Derek painted himself as the hero of my most traumatic experience. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text message that I ignored, then another, and another. I glanced down to see messages from fellow veterans who were watching the funeral live stream, friends from my unit who couldn't make it to California for the service. Their confusion and anger leaped off the screen in all caps. What the hell is happening? And why is your brother taking credit for your service? And Marcus, what is this bullshit? The reality of Derek's deception was spreading in real time through the veteran community. But here in the church, his performance continued unchallenged. He'd moved on to describing my recovery at Walter Reed, the months of physical therapy, the struggle with PTSD, the slow journey back to something resembling normal life. All of it delivered with the perfect mixture of vulnerability and strength that made the audience lean forward in their seat. The hardest part, Derek said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, wasn't the physical wounds, it was learning to live with what Marcus had seen, what Marcus had done in service to our country. Dad was there for every step of the recovery, just like he'd been there for every step of Marcus's military career. That part, at least, was true. Dad had been my rock during the darkest months after my discharge. When the nightmares were so bad I couldn't sleep, when the crowds were too much and I couldn't leave my apartment, when the guilt over the soldiers I hadn't been able to save threatened to drown me entirely. Dad understood in a way that most people couldn't, because he'd walked that same path after Vietnam. He'd never pressured me to talk about what happened, never tried to minimize my struggles, never suggested that I should just get over it like some well-meaning friends and family members did. But Derek hadn't been there for any of it. Derek had been living his post-college life in San Francisco, working for a tech startup and dating a rotating cast of Instagram influencers. He'd visited me exactly twice during my months at Walter Reed, both times bringing flowers and awkward small talk before making excuses to leave early. I'd forgiven him for it, understanding that military service and its aftermath were foreign concepts to someone who'd never worn a uniform. I'd never expected him to understand, I just never expected him to claim my experiences as his own. The funeral program slipped from my lap as my hands began to shake with barely controlled rage. Aunt Sarah picked it up and placed it back in my hands, her own fingers trembling slightly. She leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Should I say something? Should I stop this?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice to remain steady. What would I say? How do you interrupt a funeral to reclaim your own life story? How do you stand up in front of 200 mourners and accuse your brother of identity theft without looking like the villain? Derek had positioned himself perfectly, the grieving son honoring both his father and his heroic sibling. Any challenge to his narrative would make me look petty, jealous, unstable, exactly the kind of behavior people expected from a veteran struggling with PTSD. Derek was building toward his conclusion now, his voice strong and clear as he addressed the congregation directly. Dad always said that serving in the military wasn't just about the individual soldier, it was about representing something bigger than yourself, standing up for the values that make this country great. Marcus embodied those values every single day of military service, and Dad couldn't have been prouder. The applause that followed felt like slaps across my face. These people were clapping for my service, my sacrifice, my pain, but they were directing their admiration toward my brother. The veteran sitting behind me, a man I'd met at several VA events, leaned forward and patted Derek on the shoulder as he returned to his seat. "Your brother sounds like a real hero," he whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "You must be so proud." Derek's response was perfect, delivered with just the right mixture of humility and pride. Marcus always said the real heroes were the ones who didn't make it home. But yeah, I'm proud to be part of the same family that raised a soldier like that. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and rip the bronze star from my dress blues and throw it at Derek's feet. I wanted to show the congregation my medical records, my discharge papers, my photos from Afghanistan. I wanted to call Sergeant Rodriguez and Private Chen as witnesses to testify that it was me, not Derek, who had pulled them from that burning Humvee. But I sat frozen in my seat, trapped by a lifetime of military discipline that had taught me to maintain composure under pressure. The pastor took the podium next, beginning the traditional funeral rites with a reading from Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. This should have been my time to speak. This should have been my moment to honor the father who had shaped me into the soldier I became, to share the stories that only I knew, to represent the military legacy he was so proud of. Instead, I was trapped in silence while my brother delivered a masterclass in manipulation and deception. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Colonel Janet Hayes, my former commanding officer and one of the few people who knew the full extent of my service record. I let it go to voicemail, knowing she was probably watching the live stream and trying to understand what was happening. The veteran community was tight-knit, especially among those who had served in combat. Word of Derek's performance would spread quickly and the questions would multiply. I'd have to explain somehow, but I didn't even understand it myself. How had Derek pulled off such an elaborate deception? The funeral program alone would have required weeks of preparation, careful editing of my service records, coordination with the funeral director and pastor. The level of detail in his speech suggested months of research, stealing stories from my letters home, my medical records, my conversations with Dad during his final months. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a case of mistaken identity. This was a calculated theft of my entire military career. The more I thought about it, the more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Derek's sudden interest in my military service over the past year, the questions about my deployments, that I'd assumed were genuine curiosity about my experiences, the times he'd asked to see my medals and commendations, claiming he wanted to understand what Dad was so proud of, the way he'd volunteered to handle all the funeral arrangements, insisting that I focus on my own grief and recovery. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer, studying my service record like a script, memorizing the details that would make his performance convincing. Perhaps he'd even convinced himself that he deserved the recognition, that his charm and storytelling ability made him a more suitable representative of the Mitchell family's military legacy than the broken veteran with PTSD and a permanent limp. The congregation stood for a hymn, and I rose mechanically, my legs unsteady beneath me. The familiar words of Amazing Grace filled the church, but I couldn't focus on the music. All I could hear was the echo of Derek's voice, claiming my Bronze Star, my Purple Heart, my 8 years of service as his own. All I could see were the faces of Dad's military friends, nodding along with Derek's lies, believing that this charming young man in his expensive suit was the war hero they'd come to honor. My Aunt Sarah's hand found mine again, squeezing tightly as if she could anchor me to reality through touch alone. She'd been like a second mother to me during my childhood, the one I turned to when Dad's military discipline felt too rigid, or when Mom couldn't understand why I wanted to follow in his footsteps. Sarah had been at my high school graduation when I announced my intention to enlist. She'd been at the airport when I left for basic training. She'd been at Walter Reed when I was learning to walk again after the IED attack. She knew the truth, but she was just one voice in a congregation of 200, and Derek had always been the more convincing storyteller even as children. He could spin tales that made adults laugh and peers hang on his every word. He'd talked his way out of speeding tickets, and failing grades, and every consequence that might have taught him accountability. Now he was talking his way into my identity, and I was powerless to stop him without creating a scene that would overshadow Dad's funeral. The hymn ended, and we sat back down as the pastor began his homily about Dad's life and service. This part at least, Derek couldn't steal. These were Dad's stories, Dad's achievements, Dad's legacy of 30 years in the Army followed by 20 years as a high school history teacher. The pastor spoke about Dad's commitment to his students, many of whom had gone on to military service themselves after being inspired by his example. But even this felt tainted now by Derek's deception. How many of Dad's former students were in the congregation, believing that Derek was the decorated veteran they'd heard so much about? How many of Dad's Army buddies were mentally connecting Derek to the stories Dad had told about his daughter's service? How many people would leave this funeral convinced that Derek Mitchell was a war hero, while the real Marcus Mitchell sat anonymously in the third row? I closed my eyes and tried to focus on memories of Dad that Derek couldn't touch. The morning he taught me to march in formation, in our backyard when I was 7 years old. The day he helped me pack for basic training, his eyes shining with pride as he folded my uniforms with military precision. The phone call when I earned my Purple Heart, his voice breaking as he told me he was proud of my courage but wished I never had to use it. The moment I walked across the stage at my promotion ceremony to Staff Sergeant, seeing him in the audience wearing his dress blues despite being retired for 15 years. Those memories were mine, and Derek could never steal them no matter how convincing his performance. But the public recognition, the acknowledgement of my service, the honor that should have been mine at Dad's funeral, all of that was gone, claimed by someone who had never worn a uniform, never heard a shot fired in anger, never carried a wounded soldier to safety while under enemy fire. The pastor concluded his homily and invited anyone who wanted to share memories of Dad to come forward. My heart pounded as I considered standing up, walking to that podium, and setting the record straight. I could tell the real story of Marcus Mitchell's military service. I could show them my scars, my medals, my discharge papers. I could call witnesses who served with me who knew the truth about that night in Kandahar when I earned my Bronze Star. But I remained seated, paralyzed by the magnitude of what Derek had done, and the impossibility of undoing it, without destroying what should have been a dignified farewell to our father. Instead, I watched as Dad's former students and army buddies stood to share their own memories, many of them mentioning how proud Dad had been of his son's military service. Each reference felt like another knife wound, another piece of my identity carved away and handed to someone who had never earned it. Derek sat in the front row, accepting condolences and handshakes from people who praised his courage and sacrifice. He played the role perfectly, humble and gracious, deflecting praise while basking in the attention. I watched him shake hands with Colonel Robert Santos, Dad's old commanding officer from Vietnam, who pulled Derek into an embrace and whispered something in his ear that made Derek nod solemnly. What was Derek thinking, as these veterans honored him for service he'd never performed? Did he feel any guilt about accepting their respect under false pretenses? Did he worry that someone would ask detailed questions about his fictional military career? Or had he so thoroughly convinced himself that he deserved this recognition that he felt no shame about claiming my achievements as his own? The service was winding down now, the pastor offering final prayers and benediction. Soon we'd move to the graveside for the military honors that Dad had earned through 3 decades of service. The honor guard would present the flag to the family, and I wondered who would receive it. Traditionally, it would go to the surviving spouse, but Mom had died 3 years ago. The next in line would be the oldest child, which was me, but given Derek's performance today, I wouldn't be surprised if he positioned himself to receive that flag as well. My phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the service, messages and calls from fellow veterans who were watching the live stream and demanding explanation. I'd have to deal with that soon, but for now, I focused on breathing steadily and maintaining my composure for the final minutes of Dad's funeral. The hardest part was over. Derek had delivered his stolen eulogy, and I'd survived it without making a scene. Whatever came next, at least Dad's funeral would conclude with dignity and tact. But as the congregation began to file out for the graveside service, I caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the church. General Patricia Williams, my former division commander, was standing near the exit in her dress blues, her expression unreadable but her presence unmistakable. She wasn't on the funeral guest list that Derek had compiled. She wasn't someone who would have known about the service through normal channels, which meant she was here for a reason, and given the messages flooding my phone from the veteran community, I had a feeling that reason wasn't going to be pleasant for General Williams had zero tolerance for stolen valor, having spent her entire career fighting to ensure that military honors and recognition went to those who had earned them. If she'd watched Derek's performance, if she'd seen him claim credit for my service, then my brother's elaborate deception was about to face its first real challenge. The thought should have brought me satisfaction, but instead, I felt only a deep weariness. This was Dad's funeral, not a courtroom for adjudicating stolen valor claims. Whatever confrontation was coming would overshadow the dignified farewell Dad deserved, turning his final ceremony into a circus of accusations and explanations. Derek had managed to steal not just my military identity, but also the peaceful conclusion to our father's life. As I stood to follow the congregation outside, General Williams caught my eye and nodded slightly, a gesture that conveyed both recognition and support. She knew who I was, knew what I'd done in service to my country, knew that the Bronze Star and Purple Heart were mine by right. In a few minutes, at the graveside, Derek would face someone who couldn't be charmed or manipulated, someone who had the authority and knowledge to challenge his stolen narrative. I limped slowly toward the exit,
my left leg aching in the cold December air, the weight of my medals pressing against my chest with each step.
Behind me, Derek was still accepting condolences and praise from departing mourners, still playing the role of the humble war hero with perfect conviction. He had no idea that his performance was about to be interrupted by someone who actually understood what military service meant, what it cost, and what it was worth. The graveside service would be the final act of Dad's funeral, but I had a feeling it might also be the first act of a very different kind of drama. One where the truth finally had a chance to speak. The graveside ceremony unfolded with military precision, but I could feel the tension crackling in the air like static before a thunderstorm. The honor guard had positioned themselves around Dad's flag-draped casket, their movements crisp and synchronized as they prepared for the final salute. Derek stood at the head of the grave, still basking in the admiration of mourners who continued to approach him with handshakes and whispered words of gratitude for his fictional service. General Williams had positioned herself strategically at the edge of the gathering, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid immediate attention. Her presence was like a loaded weapon, and I could see Derek hadn't noticed her yet. He was too busy accepting condolences from Colonel Santos, who was sharing stories about Dad's Vietnam service and how proud he must have been to have a son follow in his footsteps with such distinction. The irony was suffocating. Here was a genuine war hero, a man who had served 3 tours in some of the worst fighting of the Vietnam conflict, praising Derek for achievements he'd never earned while standing mere feet from the woman who had actually earned them. Colonel Santos had known me since I was a child, had attended my high school graduation, had even written one of my letters of recommendation for officer candidate school. Yet Derek's performance had been so convincing that even someone who knew our family intimately was buying into the deception. I watched Derek's face as he listened to Colonel Santos, noting the way he nodded at just the right moments, how he managed to look both humble and proud simultaneously. My brother had always been gifted at reading people, understanding exactly what they wanted to hear and delivering it with perfect timing. It was a skill that had served him well in sales, in dating, and every social situation where charm could substitute for substance. But this wasn't a cocktail party or a business meeting. This was the theft of my identity, my service, my sacrifice. The chaplain stepped forward to begin the graveside service, his voice carrying across the cemetery as he spoke about the honor of military service and the debt we owed to those who had worn the uniform. Each word felt like an accusation, knowing that Derek was standing there accepting recognition for wearing a uniform he'd never earned the right to put on. I fingered the edges of my own dress blues, feeling the weight of ribbons I'd bled for while Derek wore expensive black suit that probably cost more than my monthly disability payment. As the chaplain spoke, my mind drifted to the last conversation I'd had with Dad about my military service. It was 3 weeks before he died, when the morphine made him lucid enough for real conversation, but weak enough that every word was precious. He'd taken my hand in his, those hands that had once been strong enough to field strip a rifle blindfolded, but were now paper-thin and fragile. "Marcus," he'd whispered, using the nickname he'd given me as a child when I insisted on following him around the base like a small soldier. "I need you to know something. What you did over there, what you sacrificed, what you earned, that's the proudest I've ever been of anything in my life. Not because you're my daughter, but because you're a warrior. A real warrior." Those words had meant everything to me, validation from the man whose approval I'd sought my entire life. Dad understood what it meant to serve, what it cost, what it was worth. He'd seen my scars, both visible and invisible. He'd held me when the nightmares made sleep impossible. He'd been there when I had to learn to walk again, when I had to rebuild my sense of self after coming home from a war that most people preferred to ignore. And now Derek was claiming all of it, standing at Dad's grave accepting praise for being the warrior Dad had been so proud of. The betrayal cut deeper than any enemy bullet ever could. The honor guard raised their rifles for the 3-volley salute, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the cemetery. I flinched involuntarily, the sound triggering memories of firefights in Afghanistan, of the moment that IED exploded and changed my life forever. The involuntary reaction was something I'd worked on in therapy, but certain sounds still took me back to that desert highway where everything went wrong and somehow went right at the same time. Derek didn't flinch. Of course he did. He'd never been under fire, never had to worry about sniper rounds or mortar attacks or the constant vigilance that kept you alive in a war zone. He stood perfectly still, hand over his heart, playing the part of the seasoned veteran who had learned to control his reactions through combat experience. It was another lie in a tapestry of deception that seemed to grow more elaborate with each passing moment. As the final rifle report faded, the bugler began playing taps, the haunting melody that had marked the end of so many military ceremonies I'd attended. I'd heard it at too many funerals for soldiers who didn't make it home, young men and women who died in places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. Each note felt like a tribute not just to Dad but to all of us who had served, who had answered the call when our country needed us. But Derek was receiving that tribute under false pretenses, accepting honor meant for someone else, standing where I should be standing if he hadn't stolen my identity so completely. The bugler hit the final notes, clear and pure in the cold December air, and I found myself fighting back tears that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with rage. The honor guard began the flag folding ceremony, their white gloves moving with practiced precision as they transformed Dad's casket flag into the tight triangle that would be presented to the family. This was the moment I'd been dreading, wondering who would receive the flag that represented Dad's 30 years of service. Traditionally, it should go to the surviving spouse, but Mom had been gone for 3 years. The next in line would be the oldest child, which was me. But Derek had already positioned himself to receive the flag, stepping forward as the honor guard completed their ceremony. The sergeant in charge, a young man I didn't recognize, approached Derek with the folded flag and began the traditional presentation. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's honorable and faithful service. Derek accepted the flag with appropriate solemnity, cradling it against his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world, which it was. In a way, that flag represented everything Dad had believed in, everything he'd fought for, everything he'd tried to pass on to his children, and now it was in the hands of someone who had never understood any of it, who had turned military service into a costume to be worn for personal gain. The ceremony should have ended there, with final prayers and the gradual dispersal of mourners. But as the chaplain began his closing benediction, I noticed General Williams moving closer to the graveside. She hadn't spoken to anyone yet, hadn't introduced herself or explained her presence. She was simply observing, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Derek's performance. I knew General Williams by reputation even before I'd served under her command. She was a legend in the Army, one of the first women to command a combat brigade and someone who had broken through barriers that had seemed insurmountable when I was a young soldier. She'd earned her stars through competence and courage, never accepting anything she hadn't worked for, never taking credit for achievements that belonged to others. More importantly for the current situation, General Williams had a well-documented hatred of stolen valor. She'd personally testified in several court cases involving people who had falsely claimed military service or decorations. I'd heard her speak about it at veterans' events, her voice filled with cold fury as she described stolen valor as the ultimate disrespect to those who had actually served. As the chaplain finished his prayer, Derek began receiving the final round of condolences from departing mourners. Colonel Santos approached him again, this time pulling Derek aside for what appeared to be a private conversation. I couldn't hear their words, but I could see Derek nodding earnestly as the colonel spoke, probably sharing more stories about Dad's pride in his son's military achievements. That's when General Williams made her move. She approached the two men with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, her dress uniform immaculate despite the cold wind that was making everyone else shiver. Colonel Santos noticed her first, his face lighting up with recognition as he snapped to attention despite his advanced age. "General Williams," he said, his voice carrying the respect due to a superior officer. "I didn't know you were attending the service." "Colonel Santos," she replied, returning his salute crisply. "I came to pay my respects to Colonel Mitchell. He was a good soldier and a good man." Her eyes shifted to Derek, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he realized he was being scrutinized by someone in General Star. "And you must be Derek Mitchell." Derek's smile was automatic, the practiced charm that had carried him through countless social situations. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming to honor my father." He would have been touched to know that someone of your rank took the time to attend. General Williams didn't return the smile. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but I could see the calculation in her eyes as she studied Derek's face. I understand you served in Afghanistan, she said, her tone carefully neutral. What unit were you? The question was simple, direct and completely devastating. Derek's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered, but I caught the flash of panic in his eye. He'd memorized the details of my service record, but he hadn't prepared for a quiz from someone who actually understood military organization and could spot inconsistencies in his story. I was with the Rangers, Derek said, falling back on the basic facts he'd stolen from my service record. 75th Ranger Regiment. Which battalion? General Williams pressed, her tone still conversational but with an edge that suggested she already knew the answer. Derek's hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was there. He'd focused on the dramatic elements of my story, the combat actions and decorations, but he hadn't bothered to memorize the administrative details that any real veteran would know without thinking. 2nd Battalion, he said finally, gambling on the most famous of the Ranger units. General Williams nodded slowly, as if filing that information away for future reference. And your company? This time Derek's pause was longer, more obvious. Colonel Santos was watching the exchange with growing confusion, clearly sensing that something was wrong but not understanding. I could see other mourners beginning to take notice of the conversation, drawn by the unmistakable tension in General Williams' questioning. Alpha Company, Derek said, his voice less confident now. Interesting, General Williams replied. Because I just spoke with Colonel James Morrison, who commands Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion. He was very surprised to learn that one of his soldiers had received a Bronze Star and Purple Heart without his knowledge. The words hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Derek's face went pale, his practiced charm crumbling as he realized that his deception was about to be exposed in front of everyone who had just praised him for his fictional heroism. Colonel Santos took a step back, his confusion giving way to understanding and then to disgust as the implications became clear. I think there's been some misunderstanding, Derek stammered, but General Williams cut him off with a gesture. The only misunderstanding, she said, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in uniform, is why you thought you could claim someone else's service record without consequences. She looked around at the gathered mourners, many of whom were now openly staring at the confrontation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid you've been deceived. Derek Mitchell has never served in the military. He has never been to Afghanistan or Iraq. He has never earned a Bronze Star or Purple Heart or any other military decoration. The gasps and murmurs from the crowd were audible, but General Williams wasn't finished. She turned to scan the mourners until her eyes found me, still standing near the back of the group, frozen by the enormity of what was happening. The real owner of those decorations, General Williams continued, the actual recipient of the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, the soldier who served 8 years in the Rangers and earned every ribbon through blood and sacrifice, is standing right there. All eyes turned to me, and I felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. Some faces showed confusion, others dawning understanding, still others outright disbelief. These people had just listened to Derek deliver a moving eulogy about military service, had praised him for his courage and sacrifice, had thanked him for his service to the country. Now they were being told that everything they'd heard was a lie. Derek looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. His face had gone from pale to gray, and his hands were shaking as he clutched Dad's flag against his chest. I can explain, he said weakly, but his voice was lost in the growing murmur of angry voices from the crowd. You will explain, General Williams said, her tone leaving no room for argument, but first you will return that flag to its rightful recipient, the oldest surviving child of Colonel Mitchell, who also happens to be the decorated war veteran you've been impersonating. The walk from the back of the crowd to where Derek stood felt like the longest patrol of my military career. Every step was agony, not from my physical injuries, but from the emotional weight of having my stolen identity returned to me in such a public and dramatic fashion. This wasn't how I'd wanted the truth to come out. I'd wanted to preserve Dad's dignity, to let his funeral be about him rather than about family drama and stolen valor. But as I approached Derek, I could see that there was no other way this could have ended. My brother had constructed such an elaborate deception that it would have required equally dramatic revelation to expose it. He'd gambled that no one would challenge his story, that his charm and preparation would carry him through any scrutiny. He hadn't counted on someone like General Williams being in the audience. Derek's hands were trembling as he held out the flag, unable to meet my eyes as he performed this final act of surrender. "Marcus, I'm sorry," he whispered, but the words felt hollow after everything that had happened. I took the flag from him, feeling its weight in my hands. It was surprisingly heavy, dense with meaning and memory, and the accumulated respect of a grateful nation. This was what Dad had earned through 3 decades of service, what he'd wanted his children to understand and carry forward. Instead, one of his children had tried to steal it while the other had been too shocked to fight back. "Thank you," I said to General Williams, my voice barely steady enough to form the words. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," she replied, using my final rank with the respect it deserved. "I'm sorry this had to happen at your father's funeral, but stolen valor is an insult to every person who has ever worn the uniform, and it cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged." Colonel Santos approached me with tears in his eyes, his face a mixture of shame and anger. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have recognized the real soldier." He pulled me into an embrace, his old soldier's strength surprising in his aged frame. "Your father talked about you constantly, about your service, your decorations, your courage. I should have realized. It's not your fault," I told him, though part of me wondered how so many people who knew our family could have been fooled so completely. Derek's performance had been masterful, I had to admit. He'd studied my service record like an actor learning a role, and he'd delivered it with conviction that would have been admirable if it hadn't been so completely fraudulent. Other mourners were approaching now, offering apologies and expressing their outrage at Derek's deception. The veteran who had complimented Derek on his brother's service earlier was particularly vocal in his anger. "I served 2 tours in Iraq," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "I know what it means to earn those ribbons. What your brother did is despicable." Derek had retreated to the edge of the gathering, looking like he wanted to run but knowing that escape would only make things worse. Several people were taking photos with their phones, and I realized that this confrontation would probably be all over social media within hours. The veteran community was tight-knit and unforgiving when it came to stolen valor. Derek's name would be mud in every VFW and American Legion post in the country by tomorrow morning. General Williams was speaking quietly with several of the other veterans in attendance, no doubt explaining the legal and ethical implications of what Derek had done. Stolen valor was a federal crime in certain circumstances, and even when it wasn't prosecutable, it carried severe social consequences in the military community. Derek had just destroyed any chance he might have had of being accepted or respected by the people who had actually served. As the crowd began to disperse, I found myself standing alone at Dad's grave, still holding the flag that represented his life of service. The confrontation was over, the truth was exposed, but I felt no satisfaction in Derek's humiliation. This was still my father's funeral, still a day that should have been about honoring his memory rather than exposing my brother's deception. Aunt Sarah approached me, her face streaked with tears that I knew weren't just from grief over Dad's death. "I should have said something earlier," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. "I should have stopped him before it got this far." "You couldn't have known how elaborate it would be," I replied, though I was wondering the same thing myself. How long had Derek been planning this? How many hours had he spent crafting the fake funeral program, memorizing my service record, preparing for this performance? The level of premeditation suggested this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated decision to steal my identity for his own purpose. As the last of the mourners departed, Derek finally approached me. His face was red with shame and anger, though I suspected the anger was directed at being caught rather than at his own actions. "You could have said something," he accused, his voice low but intense. "You could have stopped this before it became a public humiliation." The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. "I could have stopped you from stealing my military service." "How exactly should I have done that, Derek?" "Interrupted Dad's funeral to accuse my own brother of identity theft." "You know what I mean," he said, his desperation making him sound almost petulant.
You could have talked to me privately, worked something out. Did you have to let that general destroy me in front of everyone? I stared at my brother, this man I'd grown up with, shared a house with, called family for 32 years. Derek, you stole my entire military career. You claimed my Bronze Star, my Purple Heart, my 8 years of service as your own. You gave a eulogy at Dad's funeral pretending to be me. And you're angry that I didn't protect you from the consequences. He had no answer for that, probably because even he could see how ridiculous his position was. Instead, he tried a different approach, the manipulation that had always been his fallback when charm failed. This is going to destroy our family, Marcus. Dad's funeral ruined, his memory, overshadowed by this drama. Is that what you wanted? The blame shifting was classic Derek, trying to make me responsible for the consequences of his actions. But I'd spent enough time in therapy dealing with my own guilt and responsibility to recognize the manipulation for what it was. I didn't ruin Dad's funeral, Derek. You did that when you decided to steal my identity and present it as your own. General Williams appeared at my elbow, having finished her conversations with the other veterans. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, might I have a word? She glanced at Derek with obvious distaste. Private. Derek took the hint and walked away, probably to face more angry confrontations from people who felt deceived by his performance. I was alone with one of the most respected generals in the army, at my father's grave, holding his flag while trying to process everything that had just happened. I want you to know, General Williams said, that I didn't come here planning to expose your brother. I came because I'd heard about Colonel Mitchell's death and wanted to pay my respect. When I saw the live stream of the funeral and heard what your brother was claiming, I felt I had no choice but to intervene. Thank you, I said, meaning it despite the chaos that had resulted. I didn't know how to stop him without making things worse. Military discipline, she observed with a slight smile. Sometimes it serves us well, sometimes it ties our hands when we need to act. But you should know that what happened here today was necessary. Stolen valor isn't just a crime against the individual whose service is stolen. It's an attack on the very concept of military honor. I nodded, understanding her point, even as I mourned what this day had cost in terms of family relationships and Dad's dignity. What happens now? I mean legal.
General Williams considered the question carefully. That depends on whether you want to pursue charges. What your brother did was certainly unethical, and depending on how he's used his false claims in the past, it might be illegal as well, but that's a decision for you to make. The thought of prosecuting Derek had never occurred to me, but now I realized it was a real possibility. If he'd used his false military record to gain employment, receive benefits, or obtain other advantages, he could face serious federal charges. The idea of sending my own brother to prison was almost as disturbing as his original deception. I need time to think about it, I said finally. Of course, but don't wait too long. The longer false claims stand unchallenged, the more damage they do to legitimate veterans. She handed me her card, a simple white rectangle with her name, rank, and contact information. Call me if you need anything. What your brother did today dishonored not just you but every soldier who has ever worn the uniform. As General Williams walked away, I was left alone with Dad's grave and the weight of decisions I'd never imagined having to make. The cemetery was quiet now, the other mourners having departed to the reception that Derek had arranged at a local hotel. I wasn't sure I could face that gathering, knowing that everyone there would be talking about the confrontation, trying to process the revelation that they'd been praising the wrong person for military service. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts from veterans who had watched the live stream or heard about the confrontation through the tight-knit military community. Messages of support mixed with expressions of outrage at Derek's deception. Several former unit members were offering to testify about my actual service record if legal action became necessary. The support was gratifying, but it also highlighted how much Derek's deception had cost me. These people, my brothers and sisters in arms, had watched in confusion and anger as someone else claimed my achievement. They'd seen me sitting silently while my identity was stolen, and while they understood the impossible position I'd been in, the damage to my reputation in the veteran community would take time to repair. I knelt beside Dad's grave, placing the folded flag on the fresh earth that covered his casket. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered. I know this isn't how you wanted your funeral to end. I know you would have hated the drama, the conflict, the way it overshadowed your service, but even as I apologized, I knew that Dad would have understood why General Williams had acted as she did. He'd raised me to believe in honor, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what was right. He'd taught me that military service was sacred, that the uniforms and decorations and ceremonies weren't just symbols, but representations of sacrifice and courage that had to be protected from those who would cheapen them. Derek had violated all of those principles in the most personal way possible. He'd stolen not just my military record, but the pride Dad had felt in raising a daughter who chose to serve. He'd turned Dad's funeral into a platform for his own aggrandizement, using the solemnity of death and military tradition to elevate himself at my expense. As I stood to leave the cemetery, I realized that the confrontation with General Williams had been inevitable. Derek's deception was too complete, too public, too insulting to the military community to go unchallenged. If it hadn't been exposed today, it would have been exposed eventually, probably in an even more dramatic and damaging way. The question now was what came next. Derek had been publicly humiliated, his lies exposed in front of everyone who mattered to our family and Dad's memory. But humiliation wasn't justice, and the veteran community would be watching to see how I responded to this theft of my identity and service. The drive home gave me time to think, to process everything that had happened, and consider my options. I could pursue legal action against Derek, potentially sending him to federal prison for stolen valor. I could demand public apologies and retractions, forcing him to acknowledge his deception in the same forums where he'd made his false claims. Or I could try to handle this privately within the family, and hope that the public exposure would be punishment enough. Each option carried its own risks and consequences, not just for Derek, but for what remained of our family relationships. Dad was gone, Mom had died 3 years earlier, and Aunt Sarah was the only close family I had left besides Derek. Whatever I decided would shape those relationships for years to come. But as I pulled into my driveway, I knew that my decision couldn't be based on preserving family harmony or avoiding conflict. Derek had made his choices when he decided to steal my military identity and use it for his own benefit. Now I had to make mine, and they would be based on the same principles Dad had taught me: honor, integrity, and the responsibility to protect what was sacred from those who would abuse it. The flag Derek had returned to me sat on my passenger seat, still warm from being clutched against his chest during his moment of exposure. Tomorrow I would display it properly, in the place of honor it deserved in my home. Tonight, I had phone calls to make, and decisions to finalize about how to respond to the theft of my military service. Derek had gambled that he could steal my identity without consequences, that his charm and preparation would protect him from challenge or exposure. He'd lost that gamble in the most public way possible, but the game wasn't over yet. The veteran community was watching, waiting to see how I would respond to this attack on military honor, and they wouldn't have to wait long. 3 days after Dad's funeral, I sat in Patricia Harrington's office downtown, watching her review the documentation I'd compiled about Derek's stolen valor claim. The law firm specialized in military cases, and Patricia had prosecuted several stolen valor cases for the federal government before moving to private practice. Her office walls were lined with commendations from veteran organizations and photos of her with various military officials, including one with General Williams that I recognized from a veterans advocacy conference. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases I've seen," Patricia said, spreading the evidence across her mahogany conference table. "Your brother didn't just claim military service, he created an entire false identity complete with forged documents, fake award citations, and detailed knowledge of your actual service record." She picked up the funeral program Derek had created, shaking her head in disbelief. "The level of premeditation here is extraordinary. I'd spent the previous 2 days gathering evidence of Derek's deception, working with fellow veterans who had screenshots of the live stream and recordings of his speech. The funeral home had provided copies of all the materials Derek had submitted, including what appeared to be official military documents with his name substituted for mine. The scope of his fraud was breathtaking in its audacity. "The question," Patricia continued, "is how far you want to take this. Filing federal charges would likely result in prison time for Derek, but it would also mean months of legal proceedings, media attention, and reopening all of this pain repeated. She leaned back in her chair, studying my face. Sometimes the most effective justice comes from other avenues. Outside her office window, I could see the federal courthouse where Derek would be tried if I decided to pursue criminal charges. The thought of testifying against my own brother in that imposing building filled me with equal parts determination and dread. Family loyalty ran deep, even when that family had betrayed you in the most fundamental way possible. What other avenue? I asked, genuinely curious about alternatives to criminal prosecution. Patricia smiled, the expression of someone who had fought these battles before and knew all the weapons available. The veteran community has its own ways of dealing with stolen valor, social consequences that can be more effective than legal ones, complete ostracism from veteran organizations, public exposure in military publications, blacklisting from any veteran-related employment or benefits. She gestured to a thick folder on her desk. I've already received calls from 3 veteran advocacy groups who want to feature Derek's case in their newsletters as a warning to others. The idea of Derek becoming a cautionary tale in veteran publications was appealing in its poetic justice. He'd sought recognition and respect from the military community through lies, and now that same community would ensure he never received either again. But part of me wondered if public humiliation was enough for someone who had committed such a calculated and personal betrayal. My phone buzzed with yet another call from Derek, the 15th since yesterday. I'd been letting them all go to voicemail, not ready to hear whatever justifications or apologies he might offer. The messages had progressed from defiant to pleading to angry and back to pleading again. A cycle that revealed more about Derek's character than years of family dinners ever had. Have you spoken to your brother since the funeral? Patricia asked, noting my glance at the phone. Not direct, but he's left enough voicemails to fill a small novel. I scrolled through the list of missed calls, seeing Derek's name repeated over and over, mostly variations on how I've ruined his life and destroyed our family by not protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. Patricia nodded knowingly. Classic perpetrator mentality. They're always the victim of their own choices. She pulled out another file, this one thicker than the first. I've been researching your brother's background, trying to understand how someone develops the mindset necessary for this level of deception. What I found is interesting. She spread out what appeared to be employment records, social media screenshots, and various documents I didn't recognize. Derek has a pattern of exaggerating his achievements and claiming credit for other people's work. His college roommate contacted me yesterday after seeing news coverage of the funeral incident. Apparently, Derek claimed authorship of several academic papers his roommate had written, even used them in job interviews. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising, but it was disappointing in a way that cut deeper than the military. This wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by grief. This was Derek's established method of operation, a lifelong pattern of taking credit for achievements he hadn't earned. His current employer at the tech company is also asking questions, Patricia continued. Seems Derek claimed veteran preference points when he applied for the job, said his military experience made him ideal for their defense contracting projects. They're considering termination and possibly pursuing their own fraud charge. The domino effect of Derek's exposure was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. What had begun as a stolen eulogy at Dad's funeral was now threatening every aspect of his professional and personal life. The veteran community's reputation for thorough investigation and long memories meant that Derek's deception would follow him indefinitely. There's something else, Patricia said, her tone shifting to something more serious. I received a call from the FBI this morning. They're opening an investigation into whether Derek has used his false military claims to defraud the government in any way, veteran benefits, employment preferences, anything that would constitute federal fraud. The thought of federal investigators examining Derek's life made my stomach clench with anxiety. I'd wanted justice for his theft of my identity, but I hadn't considered how far-reaching the consequences might be. What does that mean for me? Do I have to cooperate? Not unless you want. The investigation will proceed based on the evidence that's already public, but your cooperation would certainly strengthen any case they might build. Patricia leaned forward, her expression sympathetic. I know this is difficult. He's your brother, and despite what he's done, family bonds don't disappear overnight. That was the crux of my internal struggle.
Derek had committed an unforgivable betrayal, stealing the most important achievement of my life and using it for his own aggrandizement. But he was also the little boy who used to follow me around the house, the teenager who had cried when I left for basic training, the man who had sat with me during some of my darkest moments after returning from Afghanistan. My phone rang again, this time showing Aunt Sarah's number. I answered immediately, grateful for a familiar voice that might help me navigate this impossible situation. "Marcus, honey, I need to talk to you." Sarah's voice was strained, exhausted in a way that suggested she hadn't been sleeping. "Derek showed up at my house this morning. He's in bad shape, really bad shape. I think you need to see him." The request caught me off guard. After 3 days of avoiding Derek's calls, the last thing I wanted was a face-to-face confrontation while I was still processing my options for legal action. "Sarah, I'm not ready to deal with him right now. I'm meeting with lawyers, trying to figure out how to handle this whole mess." "I understand, sweetheart, but he's talking about suicide, about how his life is over, how everyone hates him, how he's destroyed everything." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "I'm worried about him, Marcus, really worried." The news hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything Derek had done, the thought of him harming himself was unbearable. "Where is he now?" "Still here at my house. He's been crying for hours, keeps saying he's sorry, that he never meant for it to go this far." Sarah paused, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. "He wants to talk to you, to explain what happened. Will you come?" I looked at Patricia, who had been listening to my side of the conversation with professional interest. She nodded encouragingly. "It might be helpful to hear his side before making final decisions about prosecution," she said quietly. "Okay," I told Sarah. "I'll be there in an hour. But I'm bringing someone with me, a lawyer who's been helping me understand my options." The drive to Sarah's house gave me time to prepare for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of my life. Patricia had insisted on accompanying me, both for legal protection and emotional support. As we pulled into Sarah's familiar driveway, I could see Derek's car parked haphazardly across 2 spaces, as if he'd been too distraught to care about proper parking. Sarah met us at the door, her usually impeccable appearance disheveled from hours of crisis management. "He's in the living room," she whispered. "I've never seen him like this before. He's been talking non-stop about Dad, about the funeral, about how sorry he is." Derek was slumped on Sarah's couch, still wearing the same black suit from the funeral, but now wrinkled and stained. His hair was unkempt, his eyes red-rimmed from crying, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. When he saw me enter the room, he jumped to his feet with desperate eagerness. "Marcus, thank God you came. I need to explain. I need you to understand why I did it." His words tumbled over each other in a rush of desperation. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" The question came out harder than I'd intended, but I was past the point of gentle handling. "Explain to me how stealing my entire military career could be anything other than deliberate." Derek's face crumpled, and he sank back onto the couch. "Because I had nothing. Don't you see that? You were Dad's hero, the decorated veteran, the one who made him proud. I was just the screw-up who couldn't even finish college on the first try." The self-pity in his voice sparked anger that I struggled to contain. "So you decided to steal my achievements, instead of earning your own." "I didn't plan it," Derek insisted, though his words lacked conviction. "When Dad got sick, when I was making the funeral arrangements, I kept hearing from his friends about how proud he was of his son, the war hero. They all assumed it was me, because I'm male, because that's what people expect." Patricia, who had been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, spoke for the first time. "When did you decide to formalize the deception?" "The funeral program, the fake documents, the detailed knowledge of Marcus's service record. That level of preparation takes time." Derek's shoulders sagged further. "It started small, a few comments I didn't correct. Then people began asking for details, and I panicked. I thought if I just learned enough about Marcus's service, I could get through the funeral without anyone knowing the difference." "You thought you could impersonate a decorated veteran at a military funeral, and no one would notice." I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. "Derek, these are people who served. They know what questions to ask, What details matter? I know that now, Derek said miserably, but at the time, I was so focused on not disappointing Dad's friends, on being the son they expected me to be, that I convinced myself I could pull it off. Sarah had been listening from the doorway, her face a mask of disappointment and concern. Derek, honey, your father never compared you to Marcus. He was proud of both his children in different ways. No, he wasn't, Derek snapped, showing the first flash of his old defiance. Everything was always about Marcus's military service, Marcus's decorations, Marcus's sacrifice. I was just the civilian son who sold software and lived in the city. The resentment in his voice revealed depths of sibling rivalry I'd never fully appreciated. Growing up, I'd been so focused on earning Dad's approval that I'd never considered how Derek might feel being overshadowed by my military achievements. But that understanding came with its own anger. If Derek had felt that way, he should have talked to me, not stolen my identity. Dad loved you, I said quietly. Maybe he didn't understand your career choice. Maybe he wasn't as vocal about being proud of you, but he loved you. That should have been enough. Should have been, Derek repeated bitterly. But it was. Do you know what it's like being introduced as Colonel Mitchell's other child? The one who didn't serve, the one who took the easy path while his sister was getting shot at in Afghanistan. Patricia leaned forward slightly. So you decided the solution was to claim her service as your own? I decided I was tired of being invisible, Derek shot back, tired of watching Marcus get all the respect and recognition while I got polite indifference. For once in my life I wanted to be the one people looked up to. The admission was raw, honest and completely devastating. Derek hadn't stolen my military service because he'd made a mistake, or gotten caught up in circumstances beyond his control. He'd done it because he wanted the respect and admiration that I'd earned through 8 years of sacrifice and service. He'd wanted the easy path to honor without understanding what that honor actually cost. Derek, I said, trying to keep my voice level, do you have any idea what I went through to earn those decorations? The Bronze Star wasn't just handed to me because I showed up. I earned it by risking my life to save other soldiers while being shot at by people who wanted to kill me. I know that, Derek said defensively.
I read all your after-action reports, all your medical records from Walter Reed. I know exactly what you went through. The casual mention of my medical records sent ice through my veins. How did you get access to my medical records? Derek's face went pale as he realized what he'd admitted. When Dad was sick, he asked me to help organize his papers. Your military documents were mixed in with his files. My medical records from Walter Reed were not in Dad's files, I said coldly. Those are confidential, protected by federal privacy laws. How did you really get them? The silence stretched uncomfortably as Derek realized he'd been caught in another lie. Patricia was taking rapid notes, her expression grim as she documented what amounted to a confession of medical privacy violations. Derek, Sarah said quietly, what did you do? I hired a private investigator, Derek finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I told him I needed Marcus's complete military records for family genealogy purposes. He charged me $5,000 and got everything. Service records, medical files, even psychological evaluations from the VA. The room erupted in gasps and shocked exclamations. What Derek was describing wasn't just stolen valor, it was a federal crime involving the illegal acquisition of protected medical information. Patricia was writing furiously, probably calculating the additional charges that could result from this revelation. Derek, I said, my voice shaking with rage, those medical records contain details about my PTSD treatment, my therapy sessions, my most private struggles with depression and anxiety. You paid someone to steal the most intimate details of my recovery, and then you used that information to perfect your impersonation of me. I needed to understand what you'd been through, Derek said desperately. I needed to be convincing. You needed to be convincing while committing identity theft. Patricia interjected. Mr. Mitchell, you've just confessed to multiple federal crimes. Stolen valor, privacy violations, possibly wire fraud if you used electronic communications in the process. Derek looked like he might vomit. I didn't think of it as crimes. I thought of it as borrowing Marcus's story for one day. just to get through Dad's funeral with dignity. Borrowing? I stood up, no longer able to contain my fury. Derek, you didn't borrow my story. You stole my identity, violated my medical privacy, and used the most traumatic experiences of my life as props for your performance. There's nothing dignified about any of that. I know, Derek shouted, finally showing real emotion beyond self-pity. I know it was wrong. I know I hurt you, but I can't undo it now. What do you want from me, Marcus? What will it take for you to forgive me? The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. What would it take? Could I ever forgive Derek for what he'd done? The theft of my military service was bad enough, but the violation of my medical privacy felt even more personal, more invasive. He'd read my therapy notes, my struggles with nightmares and survivor's guilt, my most vulnerable moments, and he'd used that knowledge to impersonate me more effectively. I want you to understand what you've cost me, I said finally. It's not just about one speech at Dad's funeral. Your lies are being investigated by the FBI. Your theft of my identity has damaged my reputation in the veteran community. People who should trust me are questioning whether I'm really who I claim to be because my own brother confused the issue so thoroughly. Derek's face showed dawning comprehension of the broader consequences of his actions. I didn't think about that. I didn't realize it would affect you that way. Of course you didn't think about it, I replied. You never think about anyone but yourself. That's how you could read my medical records and still decide to steal my identity. That's how you could stand at Dad's funeral and claim credit for experiences that nearly killed me. That's how you could put me in the position of either staying silent or making a scene at our father's burial. Patricia cleared her throat. Marcus, we need to discuss your options here. Given what Derek has just admitted, the scope of potential charges has expanded significantly. I looked at my brother, this man who had once been my closest family member, now sitting broken and desperate on Sarah's couch. 3 days ago, I'd been focused on stolen valor charges. Now I was looking at a much larger pattern of criminal behavior that included privacy violations and potentially fraud. What are you going to do? Derek asked, his voice small and frightened. I don't know yet, I admitted. But Derek, you need to understand that this isn't just between us anymore. The FBI is already investigating. The veteran community is watching. Whatever I decide, there will be consequences for what you've done. Will you visit me if I go to prison? Derek asked, tears streaming down his face. The question broke something inside me that I hadn't known was still intact. Despite everything Derek had done, despite the magnitude of his betrayal, he was still my little brother, the boy who had looked up to me, who had been excited when I came home on leave, who had genuinely cried when I was wounded in Afghanistan. I don't know, I said honestly. I need time to process all of this, time to figure out how to move forward. Sarah stepped forward, her own eyes filled with tears. Maybe we should all take some time to think. This has been overwhelming for everyone. Patricia nodded agreement. Derek, I strongly advise you to retain legal counsel immediately. What you've admitted today will likely result in federal charges, whether Marcus cooperates or not. As we prepared to leave, Derek grabbed my arm with desperate urgency. Marcus, please, I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to make it right somehow. Tell me how to make it right. I looked down at his hand on my arm, remembering all the times he'd reached for me as a child when he was scared or confused. Start by telling the truth, I said quietly, all of it, to everyone who needs to hear it. Stop trying to manage the consequences, and just tell the truth. The drive back to Patricia's office was quiet, both of us processing the emotional intensity of the confrontation. Derek's admissions had expanded the scope of his crimes beyond anything I'd imagined, but they'd also revealed the depth of his psychological motivation. This wasn't just about stolen valor, it was about a lifetime of feeling inadequate compared to his decorated sister. What are you thinking? Patricia asked as we pulled into her parking garage. I'm thinking my brother needs serious psychological help, I replied. And I'm thinking the Derek I grew up with might be gone forever. Grief and desperation can make people do terrible things, Patricia observed. But the level of premeditation here, the months of planning, the illegal acquisition of your medical records, that suggests something deeper than momentary poor judgment. Back in her office, Patricia spread out the additional evidence from our conversation with Derek. We now have documented admissions of stolen valor, privacy violations, and illegal acquisition of protected medical information. The federal prosecutor will have enough for multiple felony charges, and if I don't cooperate with their investigation, they'll proceed without you. Derek's public confession at your aunt's house, combined with the evidence from the funeral and his own admissions, gives them everything they need. Patricia leaned back in her chair. The question now is whether you want to be part of seeking justice, or simply let the system handle it. I thought about Derek's question about visiting him in prison, about the broken man sitting on Sarah's couch, about the little brother who had once been my closest family member. I thought about the veteran community watching to see how I responded to this attack on military honor. I thought about Dad, who had raised us both to understand the importance of accountability and consequences. I want to be part of it, I said finally, not out of revenge, but because Derek needs to understand the full weight of what he's done. He needs to face real consequences, not just the temporary embarrassment of being caught. Patricia smiled approvingly. Then we'll schedule a meeting with the federal prosecutor tomorrow. They'll want your full cooperation in building their case. As I prepared to leave, Patricia handed me a thick folder. These are statements from other veterans who witnessed Derek's performance, along with documentation of his pattern of exaggerating achievements. The veteran community is rallying behind you, Mark. They see this as an attack on all of them. The support was gratifying, but it also carried weight. I wasn't just seeking justice for myself anymore. I was representing every veteran who had ever been dishonored by stolen valor claims. The responsibility felt enormous, but it also provided clarity about the path forward. Derek had made his choices when he decided to steal my identity and violate my privacy. Now I had to make mine, guided by the same principles Dad had taught me: honor, integrity, and the responsibility to protect what was sacred from those who would abuse it. The next morning brought news that the story had gone national, with military publications and veteran advocacy groups highlighting Derek's case as one of the most egregious examples of stolen valor they'd seen. My phone was ringing constantly with interview requests, but I decided to let Patricia handle all media contact until the legal proceedings were complete. The federal prosecutor, a former military officer named Commander Sarah Thompson, met with us that afternoon in her downtown office. She'd already reviewed the evidence and was prepared to file charges within the week. This case will send a strong message about the consequences of stolen valor, she told me. Your brother's actions represent everything we're trying to combat in these prosecutions. How long will the process take? I asked. Probably 6 to 8 months for the full legal process, Commander Thompson replied. But Derek's admissions yesterday will likely result in a plea agreement. Most defendants don't want to risk trial when the evidence is this overwhelming. As I left the prosecutor's office, I realized that the next several months would be about more than legal proceedings. They would be about rebuilding my reputation in the veteran community, processing the betrayal by my own brother, and finding a way to honor Dad's memory that wasn't overshadowed by family conflict. Derek had stolen my military identity for one day, but the consequences would last much longer for both of us. The question now was whether either of us would emerge from this process as better people, or whether the damage to our family would prove irreparable. The answer would depend on choices yet to be made, by both of us, in the difficult months ahead. 6 months after Derek's arrest, I stood outside the federal courthouse, watching news vans position themselves for the best camera angle. Today was Derek's sentencing hearing, the culmination of a legal process that had consumed both our lives since that devastating day at Dad's funeral. The media attention had been relentless, with Derek's case becoming a national symbol of stolen valor prosecution. Inside the courthouse, Derek would learn whether he'd receive the maximum sentence of 3 years in federal prison, or something lighter based on his cooperation with authority. Over the past months, he'd provided information that led to the arrest of the private investigator who had illegally obtained my medical records, as well as exposing a network of people selling fraudulent military documents to stolen valor claims. The weight of my dress uniform felt familiar now after months of court appearances, veteran events, and interviews with military publications. What had started as a personal betrayal had evolved into something larger, a platform for advocating against stolen valor that I'd never sought but couldn't abandon. The veteran community had embraced me as a spokesperson for authentic service,
while Derek had become the cautionary tale of what happened when you tried to steal military honor. Patricia emerged from the courthouse steps, her briefcase in hand and a satisfied expression on her face. The prosecution is ready. Commander Thompson says Derek's cooperation has been invaluable, but they're still recommending significant prison time as a deterrent to others. How is he handling it? I asked, surprising myself with the concern in my voice. Despite everything Derek had done, he was still my brother, and the thought of him in federal prison wasn't something I could dismiss easily. About as well as you'd expect. His attorney is pushing for minimum security based on his cooperation, but Thompson wants to make an example. Patricia studied my face carefully. Are you prepared for your victim impact statement? I nodded, though prepared was relative. How do you quantify the damage caused by a sibling stealing your military identity? The therapy sessions to process the betrayal, the months of rebuilding trust within the veteran community, the constant questions about my authenticity that shouldn't have existed but did. Derek's actions had forced me to prove my own service in ways that genuine veterans should never have to endure. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was packed with veterans, media representatives and family members. Aunt Sarah sat in the front row, her face etched with the exhaustion of someone who had spent months mediating between two family members locked in a legal battle. She'd tried to maintain relationships with both Derek and me, but the strain was evident in her appearance. Derek sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, expensive suit doing little to disguise how much weight he'd lost during the legal proceedings. His hair had gone prematurely gray, and he looked older than his 32 years. When he turned to scan the gallery, our eyes met briefly before he looked away, the shame still too fresh for direct contact. Judge Morrison called the court to order, her stern demeanor reflecting someone who had little patience for those who dishonored military service. She'd been a Navy JAG officer before joining the federal bench, and her military background had been evident throughout Derek's case proceedings. Miss Mitchell, Judge Morrison addressed Derek directly. You have pled guilty to charges of stolen valor under the Stolen Valor Act, unauthorized access to protected medical information, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Before I pronounce sentence, is there anything you wish to say to the court? Derek stood slowly, his hands shaking as he gripped a prepared statement. Your Honor, I want to apologize to my sister, to our father's memory, to every veteran whose service I dishonored through my actions. His voice cracked slightly. I convinced myself that borrowing someone else's achievements for one day wouldn't hurt anyone, but I was wrong. I hurt the person I should have protected most, and I disrespected every man and woman who has ever worn our country's uniform. The apology felt genuine, but it also felt incomplete. Derek still framed his actions as borrowing rather than stealing, as if the distinction mattered. He still seemed to view his crimes as a momentary lapse rather than the systematic fraud they actually represented. Judge Morrison's expression remained impassive. The court will now hear victim impact statements. Staff Sergeant Marcus Mitchell, please approach the podium. Walking to the front of the courtroom felt like the longest patrol of my military career. Every eye in the gallery was on me, veterans who understood the weight of what Derek had stolen, family members processing the destruction of relationships they'd thought were unbreakable. The microphone felt cold against my lips as I began reading from the statement I'd revised dozens of times. Your Honor, my brother didn't just steal my military decorations for one day. He stole my identity, my privacy, my medical records, and my father's pride in my service. I looked directly at Derek, who was staring at his hand. When someone steals your car, you call the police and file an insurance claim. When someone steals your military service, they steal something that can never be replaced or recovered. I detailed the months of therapy needed to process the betrayal, the damage to my reputation in the veteran community, the constant questions about my authenticity that Derek's fraud had created. Every time I wear my uniform now, I wonder if people are looking at me and remembering my brother's lies. Every time I attend a veteran event, I have to prove I'm really who I claim to be, because my own family member confused the issue so thoroughly. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sound of someone crying in the gallery. I continued with the financial impact, the legal fees, the lost opportunities as veteran organizations questioned my credibility while the case was pending. My brother turned my military service into a weapon against me, using my own achievements to damage my standing in the community that should trust me most. When I finished, Judge Morrison nodded solemnly. Thank you, Staff Sergeant Mitchell. Your statement will be given full consideration in sentencing. The prosecution presented their case for maximum sentencing, emphasizing the premeditated nature of Derek's crimes and the need to deter others from similar fraud. Commander Thompson was particularly effective in explaining how stolen valor undermined the integrity of military honors and damaged trust within the veteran community. Derek's defense attorney made a passionate plea for leniency, citing Derek's cooperation with authorities and his previously clean criminal record. My client made a terrible mistake driven by sibling rivalry and poor judgment, but he's not a career criminal. He's a broken man who destroyed his own family in a misguided attempt to gain approval he felt he'd never received. The argument had some merit, but it also revealed the defense's fundamental misunderstanding of Derek's crime. This wasn't poor judgment or sibling rivalry. It was calculated fraud that had required months of planning and illegal activity to execute. Derek hadn't stumbled into stolen valor. He'd constructed an elaborate false identity and used it to deceive hundreds of people at our father's funeral. Judge Morrison called a recess to consider her sentencing decision, leaving the courtroom buzzing with speculation about Derek's fate. I stepped outside for air, finding myself surrounded by veteran advocates who had followed the case closely. Whatever happens today, said Colonel Janet Hayes, my former commanding officer, you've done something important by seeing this through. A lot of stolen valor cases get buried in family politics, but you made sure there were consequences. The support was gratifying, but it came with its own weight.
I'd become a public figure in the fight against stolen valor, invited to speak at conferences and quoted in military publications. The role wasn't one I'd sought, but it had given meaning to Derek's betrayal in ways I couldn't have anticipated. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison's expression was grave as she prepared to announce Derek's sentence. Mr. Mitchell, your crimes represent a particularly egregious violation of military honor. You didn't simply claim false service, you systematically studied and stole your sister's actual achievements, violating her medical privacy in the process. Derek stood ramrod straight, accepting the judge's words with the first military bearing he'd ever displayed. Ironically, facing the consequences of stolen valor had taught him more about military discipline than years of growing up in a military family. However, Judge Morrison continued, the court recognizes your cooperation with authorities and the genuine remorse you've shown throughout these proceedings. Therefore, I sentence you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and 500 hours of community service at veteran organizations. The sentence was less than the maximum, but more than the minimum Derek's attorney had hoped for. In the gallery, Aunt Sarah released a quiet sob of relief that Derek wouldn't be imprisoned for the full 3 years. Veterans in attendance nodded approvingly at a sentence that balanced justice with Derek's cooperation. Additionally, Judge Morrison added, you are permanently banned from claiming any military service or benefits, and you will make full restitution to your sister for legal fees and damages incurred as a result of your fraud. Derek accepted the sentence with a simple yes, Your Honor, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. As the bailiff prepared to take him into custody, Derek turned toward the gallery one final time, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom. The look we shared lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of 32 years of shared history. I saw the little brother who had looked up to me, the teenager who had been proud of my military service, the man who had let jealousy and inadequacy drive him to destroy what we'd once shared. But I also saw someone who had finally accepted responsibility for his actions and might eventually become worthy of forgiveness. After Derek was led away, the courthouse steps became an impromptu press conference with reporters shouting questions about the sentence and my reaction to Derek's fate. Patricia handled most of the media interaction, but I made a brief statement about the importance of protecting military honor and the consequences of stolen valor. My brother's case isn't just about one person's poor choices, I told the gathered reporter. It's about maintaining the integrity of military service and ensuring that the sacrifices made by real veterans aren't cheapened by those who would steal their achievement. The weeks following Derek's sentencing brought a strange sense of closure mixed with continuing uncertainty about our family's future. Derek was serving his sentence at a minimum security facility in Arizona, and according to Aunt Sarah, He was using his time to complete college courses and participate in psychological counseling. I'd received one letter from him, a careful apology that acknowledged the full scope of his crimes without making excuses or seeking immediate forgiveness. I know I destroyed our relationship and betrayed Dad's memory, he'd written. I'm not asking you to forgive me now, but I hope someday you'll be able to see that the person who stole your service isn't who I want to be. The letter remained unanswered on my kitchen table, a daily reminder of the choice between grudge and grace that would define whatever relationship Derek and I might have in the future. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed, especially when the wounds were still healing and the consequences still unfolding. My role as a stolen valor advocate had evolved into something I'd never expected but found surprisingly fulfilling. Speaking at veteran conferences and training sessions gave me a platform to help other veterans understand their rights and recognize the signs of stolen valor fraud. The work felt like a positive use of the platform Derek's betrayal had inadvertently created. The veteran community's response to Derek's case had been overwhelmingly supportive, with organizations across the country inviting me to share my story and advocate for stronger protections against military fraud. What had begun as personal betrayal had become a catalyst for broader awareness about the importance of protecting military honor. 6 months into Derek's sentence, I received an unexpected call from General Williams, who had become a mentor figure since that dramatic day at Dad's funeral. Marcus, I wanted you to know that Derek's case has been instrumental in passage of new federal legislation strengthening penalties for stolen valor. Your willingness to see this through has made a real difference. The news was satisfying in ways I couldn't have anticipated when this ordeal began. Derek's crimes had resulted not just in his own punishment, but in systemic changes that would protect other veterans from similar fraud. Something positive had emerged from the wreckage of our family relationships. As Derek's release date approached, Aunt Sarah began asking about my willingness to participate in family reconciliation. He's different now, she insisted during our monthly lunch meeting. Prison and counseling have changed him. He understands what he did in ways he didn't before. Whether Derek had truly changed remained to be seen, but I'd been changed by the experience as well. The betrayal had taught me about the strength of the veteran community, the importance of standing up for principle even when it was painful, and the difference between justice and revenge. Those lessons would guide whatever decisions I made about Derek's place in my future. The little brother who had stolen my military identity was gone forever, replaced by someone who might eventually earn redemption through actions rather than words. But that person would have to prove himself worthy of trust through years of consistency rather than moments of contrition. For now, it was enough that justice had been served and military honor had been protected. The rest would unfold in its own time, shaped by choices both Derek and I had yet to make about forgiveness, family, and the possibility of rebuilding what had been broken. 2 years after Derek's release from federal prison, I stood at Dad's grave on the anniversary of his death, holding a letter I'd never expected to write. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of December day that made you appreciate being alive and present in the moment. The cemetery groundskeepers had placed a small American flag next to Dad's headstone, a gesture that always touched me during my monthly visits. Derek's truck was parked 3 spaces away from mine in the cemetery lot, but he was nowhere to be seen among the headstones. We'd developed an unspoken routine over the past year where we'd both visit Dad on significant dates, but maintain enough distance to avoid forced interaction. The parallel grieving felt appropriate given where our relationship stood, not hostile anymore but not healed either. The letter in my hands represented 18 months of careful consideration about forgiveness, family, and the possibility of redemption. Derek had completed his prison sentence, fulfilled his community service requirements at 3 different veteran organizations, and according to Aunt Sarah, had genuinely transformed himself through therapy and education. But transformation observed from a distance was different from trust earned through direct experience. I'd watched Derek's progress through updates from Sarah and occasional glimpses at veteran events where his community service brought him into proximity with my advocacy work. The change in him was visible. He'd lost the casual arrogance that had characterized his pre-conviction personality, replacing it with a quiet humility that seemed genuine rather than performed. When veteran organizations praised his volunteer work, He deflected credit and focused attention on the veterans he was serving. The stolen valor case had elevated my profile in ways I'd never anticipated or saw. What began as seeking justice for Derek's betrayal had evolved into a national platform for military advocacy that now consumed most of my professional life. I'd testified before Congress about strengthening stolen valor legislation, spoken at dozens of veteran conferences, and helped establish a nonprofit organization that supported veterans dealing with identity theft and fraud. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek's crime had ultimately created opportunities for service that I might never have discovered otherwise. His theft of my military identity had forced me to become a more visible and vocal advocate for veteran rights than I'd ever been as an active duty soldier. The platform came with responsibility I took seriously, but it also provided meaning to the painful experience of family betrayal. My phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Janet Hayes, who had become both a mentor and close friend during the aftermath of Derek's case. Saw the feature article in Military Times about your nonprofit reaching the 1,000 veteran milestone. Dad would be incredibly proud of what you've built from something so painful. The message reminded me why I was holding the letter, why this anniversary visit felt different from the other. 3 days ago, Derek had graduated from his probation requirements and was legally free from all court supervision. Next week, he would complete his final community service hours at the VA hospital where I'd once been a patient. His slate would be clean, his debt to society paid, his punishment officially concluded, which meant it was time to decide whether our relationship could begin healing or would remain permanently severed by his betrayal and my inability to forgive it. The letter represented months of therapy sessions, conversations with Aunt Sarah, and late-night reflections on what Dad would have wanted for his children. I heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to see Derek approaching slowly, as if uncertain whether his presence would be welcome. He looked healthier than he had in years, the prison pallor replaced by the tan of someone who spent time outdoors. His community service had involved groundskeeping at veteran facilities, work that seemed to suit him better than the corporate environment he'd inhabited before his crime. "Marcus," he said quietly, stopping about 10 feet away from Dad's grave. "I wasn't sure if you'd want company today." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, folding the letter and slipping it into my jacket pocket. "But I think Dad would want us to try talk." Derek nodded, his eyes fixed on the headstone rather than on me. "I visit him every week," he said. "Tell him about the veterans I'm working with, the things I'm learning about service from people who actually understand it." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "I tell him how sorry I am for dishonoring what he taught us about military service." The admission carried weight because it wasn't directed at me or designed to elicit sympathy. Derek was sharing his private conversations with Dad, the ongoing accountability he'd imposed on himself beyond what the courts had required. It suggested a depth of remorse that went beyond performing contrition for external audiences. "How is the community service going?" I asked, genuinely curious about his experiences at veteran facilities. "Humbling," Derek replied immediately. "Working with guys who lost limbs in Afghanistan, listening to Vietnam veterans talk about their struggles with PTSD, helping World War II veterans with basic daily tasks. It puts my problems in perspective." He finally looked at me direct. "It also makes me understand what I stole from you in ways I couldn't comprehend before." The acknowledgement felt different from his courtroom apologies, more specific and personal. "What do you mean?" Derek was quiet for several moments, clearly choosing his words carefully. "When you serve in combat, you join a brotherhood that civilians can observe but never truly enter. The veterans I work with have a bond forged by shared sacrifice that creates instant recognition and mutual respect." He gestured toward Dad's headstone. "I stole your membership in that brotherhood, made people question your right to belong to something you'd earned through blood." The insight surprised me with its accuracy. Derek had identified something I'd struggled to articulate even in therapy, the way his stolen valor had damaged, not just my reputation, but my sense of belonging in the veteran community. The questions about my authenticity had forced me to prove my service in ways that genuine veterans should never have to endure. "The hardest part," I said, "wasn't the legal proceedings or the media attention. It was wondering if other veterans would always see me as the woman whose brother confused things so badly that my own service became questionable." "Have they?" Derek asked. "Do they still question you?" I considered the question honestly. The advocacy work has helped rebuild trust, and the veteran community tends to judge people by their current actions rather than past associations. I studied Derek's face, noting the genuine concern in his expression, but it took years of extra effort to repair damage that should never have existed. Derek absorbed this information with visible pain, understanding perhaps for the first time the long-term consequences of his actions beyond his own punishment. Is there anything I can do to help repair that damage? Any way I can make amends that goes beyond just serving my sentence? The question had been building toward this moment for months, the possibility of Derek actively working to undo some of the harm he'd caused rather than simply accepting punishment passively. I pulled the letter from my pocket, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. I've been working with military publications on a series about stolen valor and its impact on real veterans. They want perspectives from both victims and perpetrators. I held up the letter. I wrote you an invitation to participate, to share your story as a cautionary tale about the real consequences of stealing military honor. Derek's eyes widened as he understood what I was offering. You want me to publicly detail what I did and why it was wrong. I want you to help prevent other people from making the same mistakes. I clarified. Your story could be powerful precisely because you're not just another criminal trying to minimize your action. You've actually worked with veterans, seen what real service looks like, understood what you stole. The proposal would require Derek to relive his crimes publicly, to accept responsibility in forums where other potential stolen valor criminals might see the consequence. It would be humiliating and uncomfortable, but it would also serve a purpose beyond his personal redemption. Would you be part of it? Derek asked. Would you share the platform with me? The question touched on the heart of what this anniversary visit represented. Whether we could move from parallel grief to genuine reconciliation. If you're genuinely committed to making amends rather than just serving time, then we could present together, show how stolen valor affects both the perpetrator and the victim. Derek was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of what I was proposing. Joint appearances would require us to work together, to present a united front in advocating against stolen valor despite our fractured relationship. It would be a form of family reconciliation built around shared purpose rather than simply resumed affection. I'd like that, Derek said finally. Not because it would help our relationship, though I hope it might, but because it's the right thing to do. The veterans I work with deserve better than people who steal their honor. I handed him the letter, watching as he read my formal invitation to participate in the military publication series. His eyes moved quickly across the page, taking in the details of what would be required: multiple interviews, joint presentations at veteran events, and ongoing availability to speak about stolen valor prevention. This is more comprehensive than I expected, Derek said, folding the letter carefully. You're offering me a chance to become part of the solution, rather than just a cautionary tale. That's exactly what I'm offering, I confirmed. But Derek, this isn't about forgiveness or family reconciliation. This is about service to the veteran community. If you participate, it has to be because you genuinely want to prevent others from making your mistakes, not because you think it will repair our relationship. Derek nodded, understanding the distinction I was making. What would repair our relationship? The question hung in the cold December air, heavy with years of pain and the uncertain possibility of healing. I looked at Dad's headstone, thinking about the values he'd tried to instill in both of us, and what he would want for his children's future. Time, I said honestly, consistency, years of you being the person you claim to have become, rather than moments of contrition, when it's convenient. I met Derek's eyes directly. You destroyed 32 years of trust in one afternoon at Dad's funeral. Rebuilding that trust will take longer than serving a prison sentence. I understand, Derek replied, and I'm prepared for. I've spent the last 3 years learning that redemption isn't something you achieve, it's something you practice every day. The insight suggested genuine growth rather than performed rehabilitation. Derek seemed to grasp that earning forgiveness was a long-term commitment, rather than a goal with a defined endpoint. Whether he could maintain that understanding over years rather than months remained to be seen. There's one more thing, I said, pulling a small wrapped package from my jacket.
This belongs to you now. Derek unwrapped the package carefully, revealing Dad's Purple Heart from Vietnam. The medal was mounted in a simple frame with Dad's citation, a piece of family history that had been displayed in his study throughout our childhood. "Marcus, I can't accept this," Derek said, his voice shaking. "After what I did, after I dishonored his service and yours, Dad earned this medal by serving honorably and being wounded in combat." I interrupted. "It represents real sacrifice, real service, real honor. You need to understand what those things actually mean if you're going to help prevent stolen valor." Derek cradled the frame against his chest, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll display it properly, learn the history behind it, understand what Dad went through to earn it." We stood together at Dad's grave for several more minutes, not as reconciled siblings, but as two people who shared a father, a history, and now a commitment to protecting military honor. The healing between us would take years and might never be complete, but we'd found a foundation for moving forward that honored both Dad's memory and the veteran community Derek had wronged. As we prepared to leave the cemetery, Derek handed me a business card from the veteran nonprofit where he'd been volunteering. "I've been offered a permanent position as their community outreach coordinator," he said. "The pay is terrible compared to tech sales, but the work matters in ways I'd never experienced before." The career change represented another sign of genuine transformation rather than temporary behavior modification for legal purposes. Derek was choosing meaningful work over financial success, service to others over personal advancement. Whether the change would prove lasting remained to be seen, but it indicated priorities I'd never observed in him previously. "That's good," I said, meaning, "the veteran community needs people who understand the cost of service, even if they learned that understanding through mistakes rather than experience." 3 months later, Derek and I stood together on a stage at the National Veterans Conference, presenting our joint session on stolen valor prevention to an audience of 500 veteran advocates, military officials, and policymakers. The presentation had evolved through dozens of rehearsals into a powerful dialogue about the real-world consequences of military fraud. Derek's portion focused on the psychological factors that led to stolen valor, the rationalization process that allowed otherwise decent people to steal military honor, and the devastating personal consequences of being caught and prosecuted. His honesty about his own motivations and mistakes provided insights that purely academic presentations couldn't match. My portion addressed the impact on victims, the damage to military communities, and legal resources available to combat stolen valor fraud. Together we presented a comprehensive view of the problem that had already influenced policy discussions in Congress and military leadership circles. The audience response was overwhelmingly positive, with veteran organizations requesting additional presentations and military publications wanting to feature our collaboration. What had begun as Derek's punishment was evolving into meaningful advocacy that honored both Dad's memory and the veterans Derek had wronged through his crimes. After the presentation, General Williams approached our table where we were signing books and resource materials for attendees. "You've created something powerful here," she told us. "This kind of honest dialogue about stolen valor will prevent future cases more effectively than prosecution alone." The endorsement from someone I respected deeply felt like validation that we'd found the right path forward. Derek and I weren't fully reconciled as siblings, but we'd become effective partners in protecting military honor. The working relationship provided a foundation for rebuilding personal trust over time. That evening, Derek and I shared dinner for the first time since Dad's funeral, conversation flowing easily around our shared advocacy work and mutual respect for the veterans we'd met throughout the day. The family warmth we'd once shared remained buried under years of betrayal and resentment, but professional partnership was beginning to restore basic trust. "I know I can't undo what I did," Derek said as we prepared to return to our respective hotel rooms, "but maybe I can spend the rest of my life making sure other people don't make the same mistakes." "That's all any of us can do," I replied. "Learn from our failures, and try to leave things better than we found them." As I flew home the next morning, I reflected on the journey from Dad's funeral to this moment of cautious partnership with Derek. The road had been longer and more painful than I'd ever imagined, filled with legal proceedings, family conflict, and personal growth that neither of us had sought but both had needed. Derek would never be the brother I'd grown up with, and I would never forget the depth of his betrayal. But he was becoming someone I could respect again, someone who understood the cost of stolen valor and was committed to preventing others from paying that price. It wasn't the family reconciliation Aunt Sarah had hoped for, but it was a form of healing that honored both Dad's memory and the veterans Derek had wronged. The letter I'd written to Derek on that anniversary morning had opened a door to redemption that neither of us had been sure existed. 3 years later, that door had led to meaningful work that gave purpose to our shared pain and created something positive from the wreckage of family trust. Dad would have been proud of what we'd built together, not because we'd forgiven and forgotten, but because we'd found a way to serve something larger than ourselves. In the end, that service was the most fitting tribute we could offer to the man who had taught us both the importance of honor, even when we'd forgotten that lesson along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.